For 4 years, they prepared for this moment, not for victory, but for delay. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing from every direction. In the east, Soviet forces were already pushing toward Berlin. In the west, American and British armies had broken through the Ardennes and were advancing faster than German planners thought possible. Cities were falling, supply lines were shattered, and command structures were stretched thin. But one natural barrier still remained: the Rhine River. Wide, fast, and difficult to cross under fire, the Rhine was Germany's last real defensive line in the west. If held properly, it could slow the Allied advance by weeks, even months. And in a war where time was all Germany had left, that mattered more than territory. So, the bridges became everything. Every major crossing along the Rhine had been studied, reinforced, and wired for demolition. The plan was simple in theory: hold the enemy at the river, and if they got too close, destroy the bridges and force them into costly river crossings under fire. Among those crossings stood one structure that was never meant to be used by the enemy: the Ludendorff Bridge at Rhine. Built during the First World War, it was a heavy steel railway bridge designed to move troops and equipment quickly across the river. By 1945, it had been converted into a critical defensive asset. Engineers had spent years preparing it for destruction. Charges were placed at key structural points. Backup detonators were installed. Electrical firing systems were tested and retested. On paper, it was a perfect demolition setup. If the order came, the bridge would fall into the Rhine in seconds. But war on paper and war in reality are never the same. Because there was another layer to this system, one that would prove far more dangerous than any explosive: orders. After a series of premature demolitions earlier in the war, bridges destroyed too early, cutting off German troops and causing chaos, Hitler issued a strict directive: no bridge was to be destroyed without explicit authorization. Commanders who acted too soon would be punished severely. The intention was control. The result was hesitation. Now every bridge commander along the Rhine aced the same impossible equation: destroy too early and you risk execution for disobedience. Wait too long and the enemy captures the bridge intact. There was no safe decision, only consequences. At Rhine, this pressure sat squarely on the shoulders of a small, under-resourced garrison. The men assigned to defend the bridge were not elite units. Many were older soldiers, replacements, or troops pulled together from different formations. Their equipment was inconsistent, their communication lines were unreliable, and their orders were anything but clear. Hold the bridge, prepare to destroy it, do not destroy it without permission, and above all, do not fail. As American forces advanced faster than expected, the timeline collapsed. What had been planned over years now had to be executed in hours, then minutes. Reports from the front were confusing. Some units were retreating, others were cut off. Commanders argued over whether the Americans were probing or launching a full assault. Messages moved slowly up and down the chain of command, each level adding delay. At the bridge itself, the engineers checked their charges. Wires ran along the structure, connecting explosive points designed to bring down the spans. But there were problems. Some materials had been substituted due to shortages. Some detonators were less reliable than expected. The system would work, but only if everything went right. And in war, everything rarely goes right. The men on the ground knew the stakes. If the bridge fell too early, German troops still on the western side would be trapped. If it fell too late, the enemy would pour across the Rhine. They were waiting for an order that might come too late, or not at all. By the morning of March 7, 1945, American forces were closer than anyone at Rhine had predicted. What had been a distant threat was now a visible reality. Armored units were moving fast, exploiting gaps, ignoring flanks, advancing with a speed that the German system was not built to handle. The entire defensive plan assumed time to observe, time to report, time to decide. But time was exactly what they no longer had. At higher levels of command, decisions were still being debated. Was this the main attack? Was it a diversion? Should the bridge be destroyed immediately or held a little longer to allow more units to cross? Each question added minutes. Each minute brought the Americans closer. At the bridge itself, soldiers could already hear the distant sounds of artillery. Some could see movement on the far side. The situation was no longer theoretical, it was happening. And still, the system held. No unauthorized action, no independent decisions. Wait for the order. The bridge stood there fully prepared to be destroyed, yet completely dependent on a chain of command that was already breaking under pressure. 4 years of planning created a structure that looked strong on the surface, but underneath it relied on perfect timing, perfect communication, and perfect judgment, none of which existed anymore. What the Germans had built was not just a defensive line, it was a system. And systems don't fail all at once. They fail in pieces, quietly, gradually, until one moment exposes everything. At Remagen, that moment was only minutes away. By the time the Americans were approaching Remagen, the bridge was no longer just a structure, it was a test of a system already under strain. On paper, the German defense of the Rhine was precise and disciplined. Authority was defined, engineers were assigned, explosives were calculated, orders were written. But in reality, that system depended on clarity. And by March 1945, clarity no longer existed. At the Ludendorff Bridge, responsibility did not belong to one man. It was divided across multiple levels of command. Engineers handled the demolition charges. Combat officers were responsible for defense. Higher command held the authority to issue the final order. Each layer had its role. Each layer also had the power to delay the others. Captain Willy Brodtke commanded the bridge garrison, but he did not control the explosives. That responsibility fell to engineering officers, including Captain Friesenhahn. Above both were senior commanders who were not physically present, men who would decide when or if the bridge would be destroyed. It was a chain of command designed to prevent mistakes, but it also prevented speed. Communication between these layers was inconsistent. Telephone lines had been damaged, radio equipment was limited, messengers had to move through dangerous territory. Information moved slowly, and sometimes not at all. At the exact moment when decisions needed seconds, the system still operated in hours. Then there was the issue of the explosives. The demolition plan had been calculated with precision. Charges were placed at critical points, support piers and load-bearing sections. If everything worked, the bridge would collapse completely. But what was planned and what was delivered were not the same. Due to shortages, some materials were not what engineers had requested. Some explosives were lower quality. In certain areas, the amount placed was below calculation. These were not small details. They were the difference between total destruction and partial failure. Captain Friesenhahn understood this. He knew the system was not as strong as it appeared. The charges would likely damage the bridge, but full destruction was uncertain. Still, preparations continued. Wires were laid, circuits were tested, backup systems were installed. On the surface, everything looked ready, but underneath, there were cracks. As American forces moved closer, pressure on the German command intensified. Reports became urgent but not clearer. Some officers argued the bridge should be destroyed immediately. Others insisted it remain intact for retreating units. No one wanted to make the wrong decision, because the consequences were already known. Hitler's order had created a climate of fear. Officers who acted without authorization risked execution. So even as the situation deteriorated, hesitation remained. At Remagen, that hesitation translated into delay. Messages were sent requesting permission to destroy the bridge. Responses were slow, sometimes contradictory. Authority shifted as units retreated. No one was fully in control. And yet,
Everyone was responsible. Meanwhile, time was running out. American armored units were advancing with a speed the German system could not match. They were not waiting for perfect information. Field commanders made decisions based on what they saw, not on orders that might arrive too late. This difference was becoming decisive. At the bridge, the defenders could hear the war approaching. Artillery echoed closer. Retreating troops passed through, adding confusion. Some crossed east, others tried to form a defense. The situation was chaotic. But the system was not designed for chaos. It was designed for control. And control requires time. By late morning on March 7th, American forces were within striking distance. The window for an orderly decision had closed. What remained was a margin measured in minutes. And still, the final order had not been clearly executed. At some level, the decision to destroy the bridge had likely been made, but decisions did not translate instantly into action. They had to move through channels, be confirmed, and carried out. Every step introduced delay. At Rhine, the system was doing exactly what it was designed to do: enforce discipline and prevent unauthorized action. But in doing so, it prevented the one thing that now mattered most: speed. The bridge stood ready to be destroyed, controlled by a chain of command that could no longer keep up with reality. It was ready, but not ready in time.
By the morning of March 7, 1945, the situation at Rhine had already moved beyond planning. What remained was reaction. American forces advancing through Western Germany were not supposed to reach the Rhine this quickly. The German command expected resistance, delays, and time to organize a controlled withdrawal. Instead, U.S. armored units were moving faster than intelligence could track. Among them was Combat Command B of the U.S. 9th Armored Division. Their orders were clear: advance to the Rhine, but do not attempt a crossing. The assumption was that every bridge would already be destroyed. That assumption was about to fail. As forward elements approached the town of Rhine, something unexpected appeared through the haze and smoke. The bridge was still standing. At first, it didn't make sense. Reports had consistently indicated that German forces were demolishing crossings as they retreated. Yet here it was, the Ludendorff Bridge, intact, stretching across the Rhine. For a few seconds, there was hesitation. Then came the realization. If the bridge was still up, even for a moment, it was an opportunity that might never come again. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, leading elements of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, faced a decision that was not covered by his orders. He was not supposed to cross. He was not supposed to engage in a full assault on a defended bridge. But he could see it. And more importantly, he could see that the Germans had not yet destroyed it. In that moment, the structure of command shifted from written orders to individual judgment. Timmermann chose to act. There was no time to wait for permission, no time to confirm with higher command. Every second increased the chance that the Germans would detonate the charges and bring the bridge down. So instead of stopping, he pushed forward. American tanks moved into position, targeting German defensive positions around the bridge. Infantry advanced behind them, using whatever cover they could find. The objective was immediate and simple: reach the bridge before it was destroyed. On the German side, the moment they had been preparing for had arrived, but not under the conditions they expected. The Americans were not approaching cautiously. They were not probing defenses. They were attacking directly, without delay. The order to destroy the bridge had finally been given. Now it had to be executed. German engineers moved to trigger the demolition. Electrical circuits were activated. Charges were primed. The system that had been built and maintained for years was about to be used. Then, the detonation. A massive explosion tore through the bridge. Smoke, debris, and dust filled the air. For a moment, it appeared that the plan had worked. But when the smoke began to clear, the bridge was still there, damaged but standing. The explosion had failed to achieve total destruction. Sections of the structure were twisted, parts of the roadway were torn apart, but the main spans held. The bridge had not collapsed into the Rhine as intended. The difference between success and failure came down to details: insufficient explosive power, imperfect placement, and the very issues that had been known but never fully corrected. What had been designed as a guaranteed demolition became a partial failure, and a partial failure was enough. On the American side, there was no pause to analyze what had just happened. The moment the explosion ended, the advance continued. Timmermann's men moved toward the bridge under fire. German machine guns and small arms opened up from defensive positions. Artillery rounds landed nearby. The crossing was not uncontested, but the Americans were already committed. Every soldier moving forward understood the risk. The bridge could collapse at any moment. Additional charges might still be triggered. The structure itself was unstable. But hesitation would mean losing the opportunity. So they kept moving. Within minutes, the first American troops reached the western end of the bridge. Engineers and infantry began crossing, step by step, over damaged sections, exposed beams, and burning debris. Some ran, some crawled. All of them knew that time was the most dangerous factor. German forces attempted to regroup and stop the crossing. Sporadic resistance continued from both sides of the river, but the shock of the failed demolition had disrupted coordination. Units were reacting individually rather than as a cohesive defense. Meanwhile, American initiative continued to compound the advantage. Lower-level commanders made decisions in real time, sending more troops forward, bringing up additional support, exploiting the confusion. Orders were being adapted, ignored, or rewritten in the moment. Within 11 minutes of the initial assault, American forces had secured a foothold on the eastern side of the Rhine. 11 minutes. That was all it took to break through a defensive system that had been prepared for 4 years. Not because the system lacked effort, but because it lacked flexibility. On one side, a chain of command waited for confirmation, for clarity, for authorization. On the other, decisions were made with incomplete information, under pressure, and without permission. That difference decided the outcome. The bridge, still standing despite the explosion, became a pathway. More American troops began to cross. Engineers assessed the damage and worked to stabilize the structure. What had been a fleeting opportunity was rapidly turning into a sustained operation. For Germany, the consequences were immediate and severe. The last major natural barrier in the West had been breached, not through overwhelming force, but through speed and timing. At Rhine, the battle was decided not by numbers or firepower alone. It was decided in the space between orders and action. In those 11 minutes, years of planning were undone, and once that moment passed, it could not be recovered. After the Americans secured the bridge, the German command structure began to collapse under the weight of blame and fear. The Ludendorff Bridge had been designed as a trap, wired with explosives, guarded by soldiers, and reinforced by doctrine. Yet, in a matter of minutes, it had been seized by the enemy. The loss sent shockwaves through the German high command. For officers who had followed orders meticulously, the failure was incomprehensible. How could a bridge, prepared for years, fall so quickly? And worse, how could the Americans exploit it so decisively? Within days, drumhead court-martials were convened. Men who had been present during the failed demolition faced the ultimate punishment, execution. Some had arrived too late to trigger the charges. Others had been ordered to stand down by senior officers and had done so out of obedience. Their crime was simple. They had survived long enough to witness failure.
Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer responsible for preparing the demolition charges, was brought before the military tribunal. Despite the failure, he had followed protocol meticulously. His calculations had been precise, his placement of explosives according to plan. In the end, he was acquitted. The system had failed, but he had not. For others, there was no such reprieve. Soldiers and officers who could not act fast enough or whose orders conflicted with reality were executed. 7 days later, those who had been assigned to detonate the explosives and who had failed through no fault of their own were shot. The executions were meant to restore discipline, to send a message that hesitation was unacceptable. But in practice, they revealed a deeper truth. The German command system had become its own enemy. It demanded perfect execution, yet made it impossible to respond to rapidly changing circumstances. At the aftermath at Remagen was also filled with confusion. Some units retreated in panic, unsure of who was still in command. Messages crossed and recrossed, contradicting each other. Soldiers who survived were left with no clarity about the reasons for their orders or the consequences of disobedience. The sense of futility spread quickly among the troops, undermining morale even further. As reports filtered upward, it became clear that the loss was more than a tactical failure. The bridge had been taken not by overwhelming force, but by timing, initiative, and adaptability, qualities the German system could not accommodate. Every level of command had violated its own doctrine under 10 minutes, yet none could recover. The men executed had never been given a chance. They had been trapped by their own hierarchy, punished not for cowardice or incompetence, but for the rigid rules that prevented decisive action. The system that was supposed to guarantee success had guaranteed failure instead. For the German army, Remagen became a lesson in the dangers of blind adherence to orders. For the Americans, it was a moment that proved speed, initiative, and improvisation could overcome even the most carefully laid defenses. In the aftermath, the bridge stood as a symbol, not of German engineering, but of the collapse of a system unwilling to bend. Those who followed orders to the letter paid with their lives. Those who acted with judgment survived. In the calculus of war, the difference between life and death had become a matter of timing, not loyalty. The psychological toll on the German survivors was immense. Many officers carried the shame and trauma of losing the bridge, despite their obedience. Some openly admitted in private accounts that the rigid command structure had paralyzed them, making decisive action impossible. The events at Remagen would haunt the German military long after the war, serving as an example of how doctrine without flexibility can turn preparation into a trap. Beyond the immediate military consequences, the fall of Remagen exposed the fatal flaw of a system built to punish hesitation. It could not adapt to moments that demanded improvisation. Soldiers had been trained to follow orders, but not to think independently under pressure. Their inability to act decisively in critical minutes cost not just the bridge, but momentum, morale, and ultimately time that Germany could no longer to lose. And the world would remember not just a captured bridge, but the human cost of a system that had failed before the enemy arrived. The executions, the hesitation, the chaos all became part of the narrative of Remagen, a story not merely of bricks and steel, but of fear, obedience, and the unforgiving pace of war.
By the time the Americans had crossed the Ludendorff Bridge, Germany's desperation had reached its peak. The loss of the bridge was not just a tactical failure, it was a psychological blow. The Rhine, the last natural barrier protecting Western Germany, had been breached, and the methods the Germans now unleashed were extreme in both scale and ambition. The first response was air power. Hundreds of Luftwaffe sorties were launched in an attempt to destroy the bridge from above. Bombers and fighters filled the skies, dropping explosives with precision, but the bridge remained stubbornly intact. Visibility, anti-aircraft fire, and poor coordination all limited the effectiveness of the attacks. On the river, German frogmen attempted sabotage operations. Equipped with explosives, they tried to reach the bridge underwater under cover of darkness. Most missions failed due to strong currents, American patrols, and miscalculations. The bridge remained standing. Even heavier artillery was brought to bear. A 600mm siege mortar, capable of leveling reinforced structures, fired massive shells at the bridge. Each impact caused damage, but the spans held. The carefully engineered demolition and countermeasures that had been in place for years were not enough to stop the determined American foothold. The Germans also launched an extraordinary last resort. 11 V-2 rockets were targeted at the area, aimed not just to destroy the bridge, but to disrupt the Allied advance. Yet these rockets, designed for strategic terror, were too imprecise to hit a single structure effectively. The bridge still stood, a testament to the Americans' speed and audacity. Meanwhile, American forces consolidated their position. Engineers repaired parts of the damaged structure, troops secured the flanks, and reinforcements moved across. What had been a fleeting opportunity had now become a permanent advantage. German efforts to reverse it only highlighted the disparity between static, rigid defenses and adaptive, decisive action. Eisenhower later measured the significance of the crossing not in miles gained, but in months of delay imposed on Germany. 4 years of German preparation, hundreds of sorties, thousands of pounds of explosives, and countless hours of planning had been neutralized in minutes. The lesson was clear. Overwhelming firepower and rigid doctrine could not match speed, initiative, and flexibility. A system built for perfection had failed because it could not respond to rapid, unpredictable events. The bridge, once a symbol of German defensive strength, had become a monument to miscalculation and hesitation. In the end, the Ludendorff Bridge was more than a crossing. It was proof that in war, adaptability often outweighs preparation. The Germans had prepared for every contingency except one, an enemy that acted faster than the system could process. In the calculus of destruction and survival, the bridge's capture became a turning point, a moment where time, courage, and initiative outmatched even the most formidable defenses. The failure of the German countermeasures, air attacks, sabotage missions, heavy artillery, and rockets underscored a fundamental truth that the most carefully constructed plans can crumble when confronted with action that does not conform to expectations. Every explosive, every sortie, every rocket, every soldier involved in the defense was part of a system that could not bend, and in that inflexibility, it collapsed. The Ludendorff Bridge remained standing, carrying not only troops and equipment across the Rhine, but also the lessons of Remagen forward. It was a monument to the triumph of initiative over doctrine, speed over preparation, and adaptability over rigid planning, a reminder that in war, sometimes the greatest weapon is simply the courage to act. Even decades later, historians and military analysts study the crossing as a masterclass in initiative and timing. The bridge, once the centerpiece of 4 years of preparation, became an enduring symbol of how inflexible systems can fail under pressure and how decisive action in the moment can change the course of history. The story of Remagen is not just about explosives, bombs, or artillery. It is about people, decisions, and the unforgiving calculus of war. In the end, the bridge's capture was the ultimate proof that a system, no matter how carefully engineered, is only as strong as the humans operating within it. And at Remagen, the human element made all the difference.